Welcome to the second lesson of our Chinese Business 101 mini course. Today, we're going to talk about negotiations in China. Many of the skills and techniques for effective communications and negotiations are the same, but I think negotiations requires a bit more empathy and a deeper understanding of what the other party wants and values. Of course, it could all be semantics, but I like to think the purpose of negotiations is a bit more complicated because you need to align and reach a mutually acceptable agreement or a way forward that both sides are comfortable with. When we are only talking about communications, the stakes probably aren't quite as high, and it might be enough just to reach an understanding or establish a rapport. So let's say the basic goal of cross-cultural communications is to create positive impressions. That might be a prelude to successful negotiations down the road. So, what are the biggest misperceptions foreigners have when negotiating in China? In communications, we talked about impressions. For foreigners trying to negotiate in China, I think the biggest misperceptions involve our sense of logic, or how we believe things should or should not be, and how we think things should progress, which in most cases is in a linear fashion. This myopia in negotiations is where we experience many of our Chinese leadership dilemmas. So, if our sense of logic is misaligned with our Chinese counterparts, what does that mean, and what can we do about it? Of course, it all boils down to our level of awareness and empathy and what adjustments we're able to make to our AMA values. But I'm going to list some of the biggest misperceptions I've noticed in foreigners trying to negotiate in China. And for you, try to imagine how they might influence outcomes prior to your next negotiations. The first misperception is that answers can predict behaviors. And what I mean by this is many foreigners, especially when they're interviewing potential partners, develop a set of questions, and naturally they're looking for certain answers to decide if somebody has the right attitude or experience. There are two things to be aware of when going through your carefully crafted questions. First, Chinese are more likely than not focused on trying to give you the best answer and not necessarily the real answer, which is why I say a good answer might not be a predictor of behavior, especially if your questions don't fit the Chinese cultural context. Second, for most Chinese who answer questions well, it might just be an indicator that they have experience working with foreigners and they know what foreigners like to hear. So this may also not be a good predictor of behavior. After all, we're interested in outcomes, performance, and potential fit, not just the ability to answer good questions. And again, this is another source of our CLDs. It may also be a misperception to believe what you hear. At the negotiating table, savvy Chinese negotiators always talk about long-term cooperation, but be mindful that they always have hidden motivational factors that are more short-term and personal in nature. This is cultural and a function of the macro environment in China, so don't immediately assume something is corrupt or unethical. And always try to consider the individuals you are negotiating with separately from the organization, especially in terms of giving face or acknowledgement. WIFM, or what's in it for me, always applies when negotiating in China. And even if you think it isn't, thinking this way is a good way to create better impressions with your counterparts that you are negotiating with. One final misperception is don't confuse directness with honesty. It might just be a form of aggressiveness. So what are the greatest challenges when negotiating in China? From our experience, successful negotiations in China are all about perspective, which needs to be positive and optimistic, and context, which needs to consider differences in values, approach, or processes, and priorities. During my first trip to mainland China back in 2004, I had the opportunity to sit and chat one-on-one with the then CEO of Philips China, David Chang. It's a long story why I had this opportunity, but I'll just share with you a piece of advice he gave me that I still remember vividly to this day. He said, Gene, in order to be successful in China, you have to be able to manage the different shades of gray, because nothing in China is black or white. That was 13 years ago, but that advice is still as meaningful today as it was back then, especially as the balance of power has shifted towards China. To put it another way, the greatest challenge for foreigners is not being able to understand things in the proper cultural context. In other words, to think differently and to adjust your attitude, mindset, and approach. Foreigners all know about face, but few truly understand the cultural nuances of giving and receiving it. So let me just leave you with this thought. If you ever thought a Chinese person was disingenuous, did you ever consider that giving face is by definition disingenuous? Giving face literally means to praise something or someone that you don't actually like or respect. But you do it because it is the cultural norm in China, and it is the lubricant that makes it possible to get things done. It is also sometimes a challenge to reconcile short-term versus long-term goals because the messages and the realities you experience may contradict one another. It is also confusing sometimes how much attention to give to individuals versus the organization and what influence certain individuals have in deal making. Because remember, in the West, people obey laws. In China, people obey people. Which leads us to the concept of phantom stakeholders. Don't ever underestimate a plainly dressed older person versus the sharply dressed professionals, because you never really know who or why is making the decisions behind closed doors. Oftentimes, you just end up with a China leadership dilemma or an unexpected disappointment. So what mistakes can easily be avoided during the negotiation process without having to master all the nuances of Chinese culture? Let's start with patience. This means not adhering to a strict or tight agenda. Let the relationship and the building of trust evolve naturally. In fact, most deals in China are done outside of the office when people are socializing and more relaxed. Don't be and don't appear overly anxious. In the art of war, almost any Chinese person will immediately notice and leverage your anxiousness to their advantage. And don't be fooled if the Chinese appear to be overly anxious themselves. Another common mistake is responding literally to words you hear or responding to words literally. Because Chinese often say things that literally have no meaning and no value in the Western cultural context. Your key is not to misinterpret their words. This is not so much a deliberate gamesmanship as it is a natural reflection of the fact that Chinese think in a more circular manner. So we linear thinkers often have difficulty trying to be rational or logical in these situations. You will need to adjust your mindset, which also means adjusting your goals and expectations. We'll talk more about these adjustments in the next lesson about aligning objectives. Now that we've discussed some common mistakes and misperceptions, it's time to give you my killer tips. Imagination and purpose-driven curiosity are the keys to cross-cultural performance. So try to imagine how these tips might be able to improve the outcomes of your negotiations in China. First, it is always to give face. This sounds easy, but it's a very delicate thing to do properly. Improving the ability to give and receive face requires a mindset adjustment regarding the cultural nuances of Chinese reciprocity. Second, it is to balance short-term and long-term considerations for both the individuals and the organization. Think of the individuals you are negotiating with as gatekeepers. They can let you in and guide you towards a successful outcome, or they can lock you out. And don't be fooled into thinking that knowing someone's superior will necessarily give you access to a better outcome. And the final tip is to focus on your mindset. Focus on the process and less on the outcomes. If you can align processes with the Chinese, then you will pave the way to a more predictable and successful negotiations. Congratulations, you have finished the formal portion of the second lesson. Now, as we promised, you can also watch a short video of me brainstorming on this same topic. I will probably say many different things, but again, that's all intended. It's to give you more angles to open and develop your imagination. Please also remember to ask questions and leave comments, and I promise to respond personally to them all. Thank you. Hi, I just finished recording video number 1. Just did one take, so it's probably not going to be perfect, but I think it's a good way to go, just to try to make these videos as raw and unedited as possible. Well, for the reason that it gives you a chance to get to know me better as as a person and possibly somebody that can help you with your business challenges in China, but also because my business is just getting started. It's bootstrapped, and I really don't have the resources to hire anybody to do this professionally. So here we are. And also, I'm not sure whether I should wait for any feedback before recording this second video, but you know, if you could provide me feedback on the first video on Communications 101, and I find a lot of the feedback is something that is worthwhile discussing, then basically what I'll try to do is I'll just try to create some bonus videos just to talk about those specific questions that you have. So anyway, this second video is Negotiations 101. So what are the biggest challenges when you are negotiating with people in China? So again, a lot of the things focus on what we call foundational soft skills, and one of those, of course, is awareness or self-awareness. So the majority of you who go to China to negotiate something, you're probably in a very good bargaining position, or what you perceive as a good bargaining position. At the extreme example, you represent Apple and you're negotiating with suppliers, or you're negotiating with people who will become your channel partners, even though I think Apple is, that might not be such a great example because Apple's basically sells most things through their own Apple stores, but I think you know what I'm talking about. It's really about understanding what your bargaining power is, but the problem is your perceived bargaining power often isn't your actual bargaining power. Okay. That's part of your self-awareness. So when we get into negotiating in China, there's a couple things before we get into the tips. There's a couple things that you have to be aware of. So the first thing is Chinese like to talk long term. So they talk a good talk. They talk about long-term cooperation. They talk about long-term benefits. They talk long-term. But most of the people who are talking, they care about short-term. Okay? They care about, and we talked about this communication 101 video, is they care a lot, whether it's conscious or subconscious, they care about what is their personal benefit. What do I have to gain if we're successful with these negotiations? And there's really not a lot you can do about that other than to keep it into the back of your mind, because a lot of times it's how you present your offer that makes it more or less attractive to the individual. So one of the other things that you want to be aware of is when you're at the negotiating table and people are saying whatever they're saying, try not to focus on the words and the statements, because a lot of times that will lead to a reaction, or it will lead to an overreaction, or what's even worse, it will lead to an emotionally charged negative reaction. Now, you may think you have a high degree of emotional intelligence, but you're internalizing something that you've perceived as very negative. But that happens not because you focus more on the words as opposed to the larger context of why people are saying what they're saying. The third thing to be aware of is in China, and I guess this could also go into the Communications 101 video, is people in China really care about face. Now, I'm sure if you've read a book on Chinese culture, you've learned about doing business in China, everybody knows about face. Everybody knows about 面子, which is the Chinese word for face. I think what a lot of foreigners, a lot of Americans fail to realize is how much of an influence giving face or receiving face can actually have on the outcome of negotiations. So you can think about it like this. A lot of the ways that Chinese do business, we as foreigners think are illegal and corrupt. Okay, so we're not allowed to exchange good finances or money. We're not allowed to give kickbacks. But one of the things that is really easy to give, and it's perfectly legal to give, is to give face. So just remember that Chinese care about their face more than anything else, and we can't stress that enough. But you might not be able to perceive that by only listening to words and statements, because part of having face is not actually telling people you need face, right? So if you're focusing on just the words and the statements, you're going to miss the opportunity to give somebody face, which will help you tremendously in your negotiations. And the final thing that I think I should always mention, and I may mention it over and over again, is just this whole concept of reciprocity. So if there's a gray area that you think borderline is unethical or illegal or corrupt, just don't be judgmental. Because the way this system of reciprocity works in traditional Chinese culture that still exists today, even though you might not perceive it because China now has become so kind of non-traditional in its surface, very materialistic, very superficial, very capitalistic, very money-driven, very fashion-oriented. Because of all of these things that you perceive, you may think that you can't attribute behavior to Confucius or what occurred traditionally 5,000 years ago. But I can tell you from personal experience that this gray area of reciprocity still exists. So you just have to be aware of that. In this kind of killer tips, we're not going to expand in too much detail on the details of Chinese culture, but just really give you things that are immediately actionable. Let's just say you're going to China for the very first time and you're going to meet somebody you're going to negotiate for the very first time. What are some killer tips that you can be aware of? So the things that you need to be aware of, I just spoke about. So what are the actual tips, or what tip do I actually have? The tip that I think could benefit, that is most immediately actionable, because you can think about it in your negotiation strategy and how you want to position your offer, is to really try to connect both short-term and long-term benefits. Okay. Think about them both, short-term and long-term, and think about short-term benefits and long-term benefits both for the individual and for the organization. So just remember, the person that you're negotiating with, that person is going to consciously or subconsciously, but we just say naturally, he or she is going to care about the short-term benefit for himself or for herself. And a lot of those short-term benefits deal with face, which is tied to recognition. A lot of these things are connected together. And it's going to take, and that's why we also call this a journey towards cross-cultural performance, because learning how to be successful in China is not something that you finish or you complete. You improve over time. You train. You develop your awareness. You develop your empathy. You develop how you make adjustments to your own attitude, mindset, and approach. And you start to connect the differences in outcome. Like if you just go once and you come back, you have no point of reference. But if you're there repeatedly in different types of situations, in different negotiations, and you start to observe how people react, not only at the meeting, but how they react a week later or a month later, then you start to make the connections. And then you start to develop the ability to improve your soft skills in that area. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about in other videos and lessons. But this series is just really about killer tips that you can adopt immediately. And it's not so much that you're able to change your attitude, mindset, and approach through these tips, but if you think about these tips and what implications they may have, and you adopt them in some manner, the goal is it takes your new relationships with the Chinese, it begins them on a more positive trajectory. And if you begin on a more positive note and a more positive trajectory, you have a much higher likelihood of achieving a successful outcome. So that's basically what we're trying to accomplish through these initial videos. So this is video number 2. Again, Take number 1, video number 2, raw, unedited, Negotiations 101. Thank you for watching.